Ignat, bravo. Just a fantastic, fantastic performance.
Sarah, thank you so much. So emotional.
Yeah.
So much in this music that just
Well, you captured that, that Richter quote about that eighth sonata having so much inner complexity, and that first movement, which goes on for like 14 minutes or so, and it's an amazing like stream of consciousness. I don't know what holds it together. You hold it together incredibly internally. Um, but it's a very unusual movement, isn't it?
it's an incredible movement. You're absolutely right. It's one of the great sonata movements, and probably the greatest that Prokofiev wrote, certainly for piano, and maybe in all his sonata cycle works. It's so unusual because it is essentially a slow movement, but of course in the form of a first movement, in the form of a sonata form. But to hold it together does require a great concentration and a great sense of where you're going. And of course, Prokofiev has that sense, so we just have to follow him. But it's masterfully put together. A
Yeah,
great movement.
the sonatas just strike me now, especially in your performance, because you bring out the classicism that is in there. I mean, Prokofiev always had that classical sense about him, but they also seem more modern now than they did maybe a while ago. I don't know whether that has to do with the kind of music that's being written today.
Hmm.
Um, but they seem extremely modern, and I think the eighth experimental, and they also have, I think, in structure the eighth, there's a sense of Beethoven underneath it as well. And in your performance for the first time today, I suddenly, tell me what you think, the second movement of the eighth suddenly seemed like Mahler to me.
Well, it has that. Of course, he says soñando, dreaming, but it has this kind of uh, abstract quality about it, and it's abstracted almost literally. It seems from the reality that informs the whole nature, the whole content of the first movement, and in many ways, then the third movement, and then the second movement just dwells on its own. Yes, somewhere
But it has
from
this kind of dance like underneath it, right? It seems more immediately accessible than the first movement in that kind of Mahlerian way.
right, exactly, and much like the Mahler dance movement may do, is we feel, oh, that first movement was a lot to handle, which we might feel after almost any Mahler first movement, and then the dance movement, which often is the second, but could be the third, then it is a relief, but it always has that in Mahler that sarcastic underpinning, doesn't it? It has that. It's not quite what it is made out to be or what it seems,
It's
and that's
oh, sorry, finish. Yeah, sorry.
yeah, that's part of its great allure. Is we feel that we maybe can relax and we can enjoy it, but not quite, because there is something else underneath, and I think it's similar here.
Well, and when we hear it in Mahler, we think, oh, it's that Viennese irony. But when we hear it in Prokofiev, we think, oh, it's that Russian irony, right? Because there's irony in both of them. And Prokofiev was such a private person, I think, and not a demonstrative character. And these sonatas, the seventh, but I think especially the eighth, you feel like there's this personal opening up. And we've called this program the war years, and of course that's what's going on in the world, but in Prokofiev's personal life there's something very different going on that we hear in that eighth sonata, with this new romantic relationship that he's embarked on.
Yeah, it's I guess in some ways happy years, for him in the midst of this of the nightmare of the world, and of course, but also the tragedy of his first wife, and who of course ends up in the camps, and really the remarkably ambiguous fact of his return home.
From having been in Europe. Just for those who don't know the whole biography of Prokofiev, he leaves and he goes off really making his career as a pianist, right? He leaves, when does he leave? In
1917. 17,
really
or on the cusp of 17, 18. Same time as Rachmaninoff, and same time as millions of Russians fleeing the revolution. And next 20 years he spends in France, in Germany, in America, and as you say, building an incredible career as a hair-raising pianist, but writing music that's certainly less deep by far than what he was capable of.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be a case partially of a kind of a late bloomer phenomenon, which we see most abundantly in music, I think, with Haydn,
Mm-hmm.
who's probably, you would agree, the first 30, 40 years of his life and of his creative life are wonderful and would be unachievable for most of us, but is not yet indicative, barely indicative of this genius that is to come after 1780, and especially after 1790. Whereas with Prokofiev, it's something similar, the late bloomer effect, that his music doesn't fully come into its own until he returns home. But of course, there's also a sense that I have, that I don't think it's documented anywhere, but that he didn't allow himself to feel fully, to express fully, until he returned home, and on the one hand had that support of being at home, at the same time returning in 1937.
Yeah, it's the worst possible time. I mean,
hell on earth. And so coming home and putting himself under tremendous pressure, and of course he survived, but he had many difficulties with Stalin and with the regime, and especially later after the war in 1948, and he died in a very kind of removed from any kind of official favor, and in difficult and maybe embittered state.
Yeah, well, so I think when we think of Prokofiev, there is always the sense of he needed to return back to Russia. There was the ambivalence about the departure and the return, and then when he goes back to Russia, we were just talking about the two wives. So he comes back to Russia with his first wife, who is not Russian, who grew up actually in Brooklyn, and they had lived in Paris, and he brings her back to Moscow. And then ultimately, at the time of this eighth sonata, what we were just talking about is he's really left her for a younger woman who ultimately becomes his second wife, and abandons essentially his wife and children during the war. He's evacuated and they're left in Leningrad, right? And in 1948, it's his first wife who ends up being arrested and sent to the Gulag, and she's there for like 7 or 8 years. I mean, she's there. He dies. By the time she comes out, he's not alive anymore.
Yeah, it's extraordinary and frightening story, just as you described it. Not accept that, but that it something like this, not necessarily leaving one's wife for another woman, but just the tragedy that you just described so typical of those times, and every family had something or other like this, and very often, of course, with people never returning and being shot and disappearing.
Yeah, I think that's what Brodsky said about Akhmatova's Requiem, that when people heard it, everyone who heard that poem had lived something like that. Everyone knew someone. And I want to mention to our audience that they can open their Q&A and put questions there. And while we're talking about the horrors that were going on, especially after World War II is when so much of this begins. The painting behind your performance, which was Andy Warhol's Lavender Disaster, kind of hung there as a reminder of the horrors of incarceration, that silk screen of Electric Chair, which is a permanent part of the Menil collection.
Sarah, you mentioned about Prokofiev, the melodist, in your insightful opening remarks, and thinking about that aspect also, that Prokofiev was able, unlike Shostakovich, and we always think of those two giants, kind of, we compare them or we contrast them as we might Haydn and Mozart or other kind of composers that seem to us to go together. But Prokofiev was able to, I think, to again, to extricate himself or abstract himself from his reality, the reality of the world of his country, and to embrace and to create ethereal beauty. And I think that so there's not much, let's say a limited percentage of 20th century art, and not surprising given the horror, so much blood and so much disaster in the 20th century. But not so much art is concerned with beauty as in the old times. But Prokofiev has that savage side, and, as you say, experimental and still incredibly avant-garde, it seems to it today. But then he has that lyricism and that profound desire that beauty should not be extinguished. Mm-hmm. And we hear that particularly, of course, in that period, in Romeo and Juliet, and in these war sonatas, and in the Fifth Symphony and the Sixth Symphony, and in Cinderella. And that's, I find that so moving and amazing that it can coexist in the same human being with these other facets.
Yeah, he's very complicated. You know, I don't play Prokofiev. I haven't played the piano sonatas, but when you play a composer like that, you develop a kind of image of them. But I feel Prokofiev is hard to get to know. Now, you're also very active as a conductor, as well as a pianist, and I think it's interesting for people to hear about that. So how do you think of Prokofiev that way, in terms of his private side and how he, in a sense, hides himself? But then there are these moments. I think vulnerability is something that you hear in the Eighth Sonata. We don't hear it that frequently, maybe.
Well, yeah, and again, it's to me, it's to do mostly with the arc of his life. In the orchestral music and in his music for the stage, in the operas and ballets, until he returns, he doesn't really allow himself, you use that word, vulnerability. He doesn't open himself fully. That's my sense. I mean, of course, that is open for debate. First four symphonies don't really give us an inkling. Yeah, they give us an inkling of his gifts, of his all kinds of gifts, but not of the depth that he will show in the Fifth Symphony, in the Sixth Symphony, and the same thing in Romeo and Juliet. That's a piece that, apart from being achingly beautiful at so many points, is a piece that goes so deep into the human psyche, into the human condition, into the kind of essential reality of death that we all confront. Amazing, and that it wasn't revealed until this later period is quite an enigma, perhaps.
Well, it's very powerful in your performances because you feel, these pieces are so virtuosic, especially, the seventh, but the eighth is certainly very difficult. And they so often become vehicles for pianists, and the physicality of the pieces kind of take over. And there's something very, very different in your performances in terms of the depth behind the notes. Leon Fleischer sometimes would talk about how in Beethoven that the notes are just the tips of the iceberg. And I think you feel that in your performances of the Prokofiev. And I'm wondering, because also as a conductor, you've done the symphonies. When you come back to the piano pieces, how do you think the deep knowledge, the experience, I would say, of conducting the larger works, does that change your relationship to his piano works when you come back to them?
Well, it helps me. I think it has helped me, and I hope will continue to, in two aspects. First of all, that lyricism, that is a fundamental, critical aspect of his worldview, as certainly as a composer, must have been as a person. That, as you so beautifully put it, for pianists, for us, it's easy to get lost in just staying above water, just trying not to drown in playing these pieces, because the technical demands are so overwhelming. And often it descends into, as you say, either a show or a kind of a pounding. And it must not be, because the majority of it is there. There can be moments, but the majority of it is not. And there's so much horizontal, lyrical, string or wind, but in any case, something we can't normally do at the piano, kind of writing that needs to perhaps inform our playing. And then the second part is textures, because when you get into particularly 6, 7, and 8, these war sonatas, then the textures are so complex that they really need to be thought. I guess the standard way is to say orchestrally, but what does that really mean? Well, to me, what that means is understanding the voice leading and understanding the layers, how all of this cluster of sound, and we might have so many notes, obviously, and voices in each hand. How does all of that come out to the listener in a way that allows us to follow, allows us not to just hear walls of sound, but to hear the lines? And that, coming from the way that he orchestrates and that he distributes things in his symphonies and in opera, I think does help very much to come back to the piano works in that way.
Yeah, well, I felt like I was hearing a conductor at the piano in terms of the number of different levels that were happening at the same time, as though you were drawing them out as one draws out in an orchestral, rehearsal, or, in the performance, drawing out the different layers, but that you were able to do that at the piano.
Here, I'll give you an example that just exactly what you're saying. The end of the second movement of the seventh, just actually the end of the B section, just the kind of climax before the A returns for just a moment. There's that clock, that a semitone, right, that keeps chiming. And it's interesting that, it's one of the great passages in Prokofiev, but it's often not played successfully, in my opinion, because pianists don't actually follow the very clear markings, which is pianissimo for the outer voices and mezzo forte for that thumb, for that middle line. And this is a case you don't really need, a PhD in reading a score. It's not that complicated here. But the point is that I think oftentimes pianists think that's enough contrast. It's not. It's not enough. Pianissimo and mezzo forte, at least for Prokofiev, is a big contrast. And if we can, so I hear Cinderella, I hear the clock from Cinderella there, for example, and so it's thinking of the ballets and thinking of orchestral textures. It just makes it, I think, so much easier to maybe to get a sense of what he's after, and then to communicate it.
Yeah, and even the way you bring that out with your thumb, it actually reminded me, it made me think of Messiaen, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I studied with Yvonne Loriot, and when she would use this side of her hand sometimes, to hit black notes so that they would just, ring.
Explode.
And there's sometimes I think we're all brought up to be musical, so it's like pianists are afraid of being direct about certain things and round off the edges or whatever. We do have a question, which, speaking of Russia and all of these things, brings us back to your own sense of being Russian. Now, you came to the States when you were, what, 2 years old?
Four.
Four.
But, very young.
Yeah, very, very, very young. And your two brothers are very close to you in age, no? Because
Yes.
there's a wonderful photo. I was visiting the site of the Alexander Solzhenitsyn Center, which I recommend to everyone with us tonight, which is a terrific resource. And I wanted to ask you about the center. But there's a photo there of the three of you. You could almost be triplets in idyllic Vermont on a rock. And the caption is something about, here we are riding the magic horse that will take us back to Russia. And so it seemed to say a lot about what childhood in Vermont was like. Speaking of Prokofiev needing to go back to Russia.
Well, that is an iconic photo, I suppose, and one of the famous photographs of certainly of Solzhenitsyn and his family. But that photo does seem to combine a lot of components, and there is of course nature itself, and as you say, the idyllic kind of Vermont countryside. The idea of fairy tale, which Prokofiev, by the way, of course, was the champion. That's something we'll talk about some other time. But what fairy tale means in Second Piano Concerto, fairy tales, and so my father used that very well-worn and time-tested metaphor of an object or that represents something else, or that has a curse laid on it. And so he told us that this was that this rock, this giant boulder, and it was giant, was a horse that a spell was cast upon. And one day when Russia would shake off the yoke of communism, this horse would return to life, and fly us, like Pegasus, I suppose, another myth, fly us home.
So even though you were in Vermont, there was always this sense of home was somewhere else, that there was a temporary.
Yes, it was very much the case for my parents. Of course, it turned out to be a longer stay than they anticipated. I'm not sure what they anticipated exactly, but I don't know that they anticipated 18 years. And of course, for my brothers and myself, it ended up being the place we grew up, and so therefore, of course, a very big part of our lives. And so home was ultimately a more muddled concept, certainly for me, and I think probably for my brothers, than for my father and my mother, who, with all a deep appreciation for the hospitality they received in Vermont and in America, and even in the West in general, lived, of course, were not voluntary exiles, had been expelled, and so lived with that fervent desire to return home, to return to their friends, to their people, to their earth, to their land. And don't forget, for a writer, that crucial, almost sine qua non condition of being surrounded by his own language
Yeah.
and the spirit and the everything that goes with it of
Well,
his
and your
language.
father was, I mean, he was a symbol of Russia. I mean, it's very much like Thomas Mann coming to the US during World War II and saying German literature has come with me, in a sense. I mean, German literature was in exile. That your father was so deeply a symbol to the world of Russia. How symbolic it was when he went back in '94. That was a major event for the entire world, that Solzhenitsyn went back. Um, so yeah, it's very powerful. And in thinking of your father, who also, I think, it's very unusual the way he was both an artist and a historian and an intellectual. I mean, he was in his heart such an artist as well. And I think that's unusual when those two things are straddled, or more than straddled, in such a deep way. And I was, when you look at his work today, just as the way Prokofiev seems different now, your father writes so much. I mean, if there's one thing that seems to be so meaningful to him, it's the concept of truth, the idea of truth. And when he spoke at, I guess it was his talk at Harvard, he talks about the connection between lies and violence. And it just seems to resonate so much with what our own country is having to deal with now, in ways that I think for many of us seem unanticipated. But he says that lies have nothing to maintain them save violence. That the relationship between lies and violence is such a deep one, and that anyone who has once proclaimed violence as his method must inexorably choose the lie as his principle. Lies can prevail against much in this world, but never against art.
Yeah, that's really his credo, and that goes back. That's actually the his Nobel lecture a few
Oh,
years before
Nobel
Harvard,
lecture, right?
right? Which he couldn't deliver, of course, in person because he wasn't allowed to leave, or if he had been allowed to leave, he wouldn't have been allowed to return. So he had to wait 4 years until everything had changed, so to speak, in his life. He had been expelled to receive that award, but that idea of art as the only means, it seemed, to communicate especially bitter and deep and life changing experiences from one person to another, and even more so from one country, from one people to another. And he comes to the conclusion that it's very difficult to do, but if we can do it, if there is any hope that we are to avoid simply blindly stumbling into the same mistakes of our forefathers, or of people on the other side of the globe, and repeating the same mistakes, it can only be through art, not through documentaries, or through some kind of just factual record. And then the idea about lie, that the lie, violence is only possible ultimately, and a regime like the Soviet totalitarian machine, a regime like Hitler's Nazi Germany, is only possible. That kind of violence, unimaginable violence, is only possible when it's covered up, covered up by lie. And that famous quote, I'm afraid I can't place who it is now, but that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. And really, quite what a wonderful thing to say. And so still virtue exists, and still violence cannot be glorified unless it's, generally speaking, turned into something else. So yeah, these issues continue to be extremely pertinent, and he called for Soviet citizens, but in other words, people living in an entirely unfree, in a slave state, but it applies to everyone, to live not by lies.
Well, and the idea that that the only way a lie can be maintained, you need violence to sustain a lie, that on its own a lie will die, that in order to maintain a lie, there has to be violence associated with it, that the two are intertwined. And of
Yes,
course,
a symbiotic.
yeah, you see, I mean, you see what he revealed in the Gulag, you know, being an entire construct of lies. I mean, of you know, buildings, the whole system built up, and that because people knew they were lies. I mean, the people that the violence is very much linked to that. You know, fighting the truth then comes out in a kind of violence.
And then, of course, the Nobel lecture ends with the Russian proverb, with a Russian proverb: one word of truth shall outweigh the whole world. And that's also gives us a lot to chew on. Whether or not it's always true, but I think we need to believe that ultimately it must be true. And certainly his life and the life of his books and that one extraordinary phenomenon of artistic achievement and psychological insight, the Gulag Archipelago is I think is living proof that in the end truth wins.
Well, certainly, I mean, it opened, your father's work opened up, I mean, it changed the world, really. And it opened up to the West. I have my copy of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. It was my father's copy, you know, so it's the first edition, 1963, I guess, is when that first translation came out. And it's such an
Exactly.
iconic work. And I think it's a work that when you encounter it for the first time, you never forget it. And his concept of art, though, it seems like it's something that he had a very high bar in terms of truth and art, because it's so rigorous. The way his own approach to it is very rigorous in terms of almost what you're allowed to do, in terms of not excessive emoting, but just telling the truth.
Yeah, in the Gulag Archipelago, of course, he had to find the right tone. What tone of voice can one use when describing indescribable horror? And screaming about it isn't going to help. People will shut the book, and crying about it isn't really going to work in the end because it's too much. It's too much. We can remember, right, also that one person's death is a tragedy. That's from Comrade Stalin himself, but the death of a million people is a statistic. And
Well,
what a
we're
horrible thing! But
unfortunately living through something very similar to that right now. I mean, just with the numbers attached to COVID and how, you know, people were asked how, you know, was it 40,000 who've died or is it 400,000? And people don't know. And you realize it's just become a number. I mean, the difference between 40,000 and 400,000 is 360,000 lies. But, you know, you confront these quizzes. I confront these quizzes myself and I realize I don't know the answer, you know, in terms of numbers. So
yeah, we must have that human connection and the personal connection, and that's also why some of the most overwhelming impact of that book, Gulag Archipelago, is through the individual stories that are true stories, of course, that are woven into the fabric, the overall form. And so just that when we get to know these, especially 5 or 6 people, but of course there's 227 specific eyewitness accounts that really created that book. But these individual fates and the individual tragedies, the unimaginable scope of what happened to just one family and one person leaving, having his children taken away and never seeing them again, and saying goodbye to his young wife and never seeing her again, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's helps us to brings it across in a way that, yes, that just numbers wouldn't and didn't, because this information was widely known in the West, but didn't have an impact, it seems, in the same way until that book came out, and people couldn't look away.
Yeah, yeah. So we have a question to follow up on that. How did your father's restraint impact your development as a musician and really as a conductor, as a pianist and a conductor? Or I don't know whether if restraint.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know if I would use that word, but it's interesting. And what he believed very much was that an artist has a greater responsibility than, and of course it's a view in which reasonable minds can and do differ, a greater responsibility than just to express himself,
Yeah.
herself. And that, of course, implies a couple of things, but a big one is that truth is not relative. That there is such a thing as truth, that even if we can't know it, and we can't certainly be in possession of it, because only God can do that, but we can strive for it. And we can attempt in our lives, and certainly in our art, to differentiate between honesty and dishonesty, truth and untruth. And that's what he sought to do, and that's really that's the tradition, of course, that he came from, the tradition of Russian literature. That's in one sentence, that's what Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Chekhov, that's what they tried to do. Very different as they are from each other, but that their writing had a purpose larger than their ego or their life, or simply writing in a way that nobody else had written.
So how would you see that translating into music?
Yeah, for me, that translates also very fortunately coupled with my teachers and my training and the values that they instilled in me. That, yeah, that we play and we study and we suffer for music for some bigger purpose. And it starts with expressing a wonderfully unselfish act, if one stops to think about it, of expressing, not just expressing me, but expressing another person. Now, that's a different conversation that most of us performers don't compose anymore, and maybe it would be a better world if we did, but anyhow, the world has changed. Certainly I don't compose, but how fortunate and how great a gift it is to have that opportunity to bring across, to attempt to bring across Prokofiev or Brahms or Haydn, to bring that music across and to give people an idea really of what that person, a great genius, has to say.
Well, and maybe that's where we find the truth, because what I think is so amazing for us is that we find ourselves in someone else's creation, right? So we find ourselves through this music that we're playing, whether it's Prokofiev or Beethoven, and this is written by someone in another place, another time, but our own soul can come through that, and then it can reach other people. I mean, I find that an amazing thing, because there's it goes beyond life and death. I mean, it's just, I remember even as a little kid, there would be some piece I really wanted to play, and then I would get the music, and it seemed to me magical, right? That you could read and the piece was there. And it always felt like this, secret message in a bottle that had somehow reached us, but that it allows us to find something in ourselves that we might not even know is there.
Beautifully said, and I couldn't agree more. That how important that communication is with, and especially pianists. We just sit alone in the practice room, maybe more than other instrumentalists, and but we can converse with the whole universe, it seems, through these human beings who may well be alive and well and counseling us, in the case of living composers, but more often than not, of course, are not alive, and yet they come alive, as you say, through the score and through the sound that we're able to conjure up. It's what a magnificent way to live.
Yeah, we're all lucky. And so we have one more question. We could, I'd love to talk to you all night, but we should probably, there is a question here. Prokofiev's music sounds like no one else's. It so often refuses to go where anyone else would expect it to go. Is it even possible for theorists to analyze his music using the harmonic and melodic principles that applied to music before him, or does he just basically make his own rules? Is there any kind of, how would you answer that?
That's a wonderful question. I'm thinking about how to answer it. I think both things are true. In other words, yes, I do think it's possible. I mean, all music can be analyzed, and even deconstructed, as is the fashion now. But certainly Prokofiev's language is amenable to being graphed in terms of Schenkerian analysis, in terms of, after all, it's largely tonal. It's broadly tonal. And so, yes, it does allow for that analysis. Similarly, for kind of melodic analysis, when we think of pitch and scale degrees and so forth. For example, we can talk for a few hours if anybody would want to listen to that, but to the pitch relationships in the Eighth Sonata, and to the, for example, this role of the minor ninth, right? That in the second theme, and then how it comes back in the second movement, and of course, strikingly in the third movement. And so, what that ninth signifies. So, yes, all those things are possible and to a point desirable. But what's amazing about Prokofiev, and unique perhaps, is to what extent he is able to create that totally original sound world and harmonic world within the confines, basically, of the heritage that he's received. Because we
within
don't,
tonality.
right?
I mean, he stays within tonality. And
Right.
it's interesting. I mean, Shostakovich does too, but they don't sound anything alike, really. I mean, they
No.
create very, very different worlds.
Of course, more broadly, that also serves as a glaring, for me, as a glaring rebuke to Schoenberg, who said at one point, and I don't know that he ever believed it, but he must have believed it for a while, that tonality is finished, and that there is no further one can go in that world, and one had to depart, and how magnificently he did depart for other worlds, 8-tonal worlds and 12-tonal worlds. But it's interesting that so many decades after Schoenberg's kind of cathartic years, composers like Shostakovich and Prokofiev and so many others, Benjamin Britten, were finding really fairly inexhaustible resources in, broadly speaking, that same old tonal system bequeathed to us from the Baroque.
Well, I think Schoenberg was, I mean, I think it was also had to do with that he was coming out of the world of Wagner. I mean, it was like after Wagner, they couldn't go any further in chromaticism.
He had reached that.
And yeah, and Shostakovich and Prokofiev, they come at it completely from a much more diatonic, a non-chromatic way, which opened up a different kind of language for them. And it's kind of, well, I guess Hindemith in a way comes to something more like that. But it's another interesting thing, I think, that so much of what we see as modern or experimental, so much of it is a dialogue with the past. And it's often with the past that's most important to the composer. What is it? Picasso said something like that artists start out imitating the artists they admire most, and where they fail, they discover themselves.
Beautiful. And probably
Maybe
very true.
One last question for you. Who was your first piano teacher?
My first piano teacher was, well, there's a bit of a story there, so I'll just quickly share it. I was taken to play for Rudolf Serkin, who of course was too busy and not prepared to teach me, and didn't teach children. But he said, I have just the right person. And it was his assistant and close friend and wonderful Uruguayan pianist, Luis Bage. But funnily enough, things did not work out with Luis at first. And so he then sent me to somebody else, a Korean-American teacher called Chon Hyo Shin. And she was my first teacher and allowed me to make great progress very quickly, and just instilled the right foundation, so that then after a few years with her, I was able to come back to Luis Serkin's assistant, and then work with him for 3 very productive and fascinating years. He's passed away a few years ago, but every time I think of him, I remember so much that he taught me about music, and Mrs. Shin is still with us and alive and well. So,
and there's a wonderful story that you told us about the visit of a certain famous cellist to your house when you were a little child, right?
Slava Rostropovich was a dear friend of my father, and would stop by when he was in the area, in maybe in Hanover, New Hampshire, or in Brattleboro, and so he came probably when I was 6 or so, and he heard me tinkering at the piano, and there was just a piano in the house with other furniture that came with it, and he said, who's his teacher? And my parents didn't know what he was talking about. They were lovers of music, but not in any way producers of music. And so they said, teacher of what? And he said, of piano. He has talent. He needs to be taught. And so he was instrumental when he eventually in 2 years later in having me in showing me to Serkin and saying, please help, because his parents are useless with regard to his education.
You had some good advisors there.
Yes.
Off to a great start. Well, thank you so much, Ignat. It's just wonderful to have you with us. And as soon as we're back in the concert hall, we look forward to having you here in person.
With such pleasure. And Sarah, you are one of the great minds and just one of the great presenters and pianists in anywhere. And so it's just how wonderful that you are able to continue to do this and share with your audience and all these projects that you cook up even now in the pandemic. So God bless and keep at it, and see you soon.
Yes, I look forward to it. Take care. Thank you.
You too.